We have a number of people on the line. So again, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. We're grateful to have you here in attendance as part of our side event, sharing data from the State of the Black Economics Report, or SOBR for short. And today's event is really a side event, part of the United Nations fourth session on the Permanent Forum of People for African Descent. So there's probably some familiar faces as well as faces from all over the world who are joining us. So pleased to have you here. Thanks again. Before we get started, I think it's really important that we acknowledge the land that we're on. So I'm in Toronto. The Diversity Institute, which is hosting the session and exists within Toronto Metropolitan University, is also in Toronto. And Toronto is in Treaty 13, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people, but is of course home to many diverse Indigenous people, including Inuit, Métis, and First Nations individuals. So just a little bit about me. My name is Nancy Mitchell, and I'm the Director of Consulting at the Diversity Institute. And like I said, we're so pleased to have you here as part of a session really exploring some up-to-date data from the State of Black Economics Report, like I said, SOBR. We'll be walking through a number of data points spanning from just general demographics to education to employment to entrepreneurship. We'll talk about the way forward. We'll go through a panel talking a little bit about some strategies for staying the course amid an era of pushback, and then we'll take some of your questions. And if you do have a question, feel free to pop it in the Q&A box, and then I'll read through it towards the end. I am not alone. I'm so pleased to be joined by our fellow speakers and panelists. So first we have Jemal Demeke. He's a researcher from the Wellesley Institute. We have Cassandra Dorrington, the President and CEO of the Canadian Aboriginal and Minority Supplier Council. And we have Nadine Spencer, the CEO of BrandEQ Group. So, like I said, you're going to hear from us on updated data. We'll start with Jemal, who's going to speak about the importance of collecting disaggregated data and how it can really be used to inform decision making, particularly as we know that, like I said, we are in an era of pushback, and we know that many of you on the line do want to stay the course. So how can you leverage disaggregated data to inform your decisions? Then we'll go to me, and I'll speak about demographics, updated insights on the Black community, education, employment, where we've made strides and where we have room for improvement. Nadine and Cassandra will talk about the importance of supporting Black entrepreneurs and Black women entrepreneurs and where procurement comes in. Then we'll go through the way forward, and then we'll wrap up with our panel and Q&A. So this is our agenda. A little bit about the Diversity Institute before we begin. So we've been around since 1999. Like I said, we exist within Toronto Metropolitan University's Ted Rogers School of Management Business School. We conduct research on the experiences in the labor market. So the experiences of equity-deserving groups from entry to leadership to exit, as well as inclusive entrepreneurship and the innovation ecosystem. And what's really important for us is ensuring that that research doesn't just live on the shelf, that it's something that's accessible and tangible to everyone in the ecosystem so that you can leverage it for the decisions that you're making in your organizations, and you can use it to support diverse Black communities. Something that's also really important to us to emphasize is that we recognize that addressing anti-Black racism is really the correct thing to do. It's part of human rights, but it's also the smart thing to do. And we know that evidence shows that when you support equity-deserving groups, and particularly Black individuals, you're better placed to come up with innovative solutions. You're better placed to develop programs and services that meet the needs of diverse communities. People in the workplace feel respected and safe and included, and they want to stick around, which is important for retention. So there's all these pieces of why it's important, and I just wanted to emphasize that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing screen because Jemal is going to share his own slides, and then we'll come back to me after. Jemal, over to you.
Wonderful. Okay, so yes, my name is Jemal Demeke, researcher at Wellesley Institute. I'm here to talk about our own efforts to collect and use sociodemographic data. One moment I want to take everyone back to is the COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously for us, Wellesley, who focuses on issues relevant to health equity, the health system changed dramatically, and there had to be a very quick understanding of what is going on, trying to respond to a situation with very little information available to us right here in Ontario. But one thing that we started to see, especially as people that were focused on health equity, is that there are data coming out of places like the United Kingdom and the United States demonstrating that Black populations had higher infectious rates, rates of hospitalization, and mortality. And this was of serious concern for many of us who particularly knew that, similar trends were probably and definitely happening at the time here in Ontario and in Canada. But again, without the data available to us, it was hard to demonstrate or quote unquote substantiate these, right, with the evidence. But we also took a look at, you know, the the time that showed that Black lives were under threat in multiple ways, not necessarily just in the healthcare system, but honestly, just by stepping out into the streets, there's a higher mental load and stress that Black populations are going through. But again, very limited data that was being collected and reported to demonstrate this. And so the CEO of Wellesley Institute, Dr. Quinn McKenzie, amongst many others, so policy leaders, community advocates, other clinicians, joined together to name themselves as the Black Health Equity Working Group. So they kind of took a stand to say, hey, we think that it's really important for us to have the data that we need to identify and track the disparities that are happening during this pandemic. All in the end to not just collect the data, because having information is one thing, but how you actually use it is another. So we want to make sure that whatever solutions that we are driving are evidence-informed, community-driven, public health and policy solutions. What does that look like? So I'm going to take you on a journey of just how the collection of sociodemographic data during the pandemic occurred. So without individual level data, that doesn't mean that you can't do anything, right? Sometimes you do have to get very creative. And this is what the Black Health Equity Working Group was trying to do. So they thought, okay, if we don't have this, we can definitely glean some insights from area-based analyses. That is data that we can have accessible to us. And so they kind of collaborated with different organizations, got the access to the information they needed, and generated an analysis of different Toronto neighborhoods, right, to see what's happening. Understanding that in Toronto, certain neighborhoods have different demographics than others, so perhaps we can glean some insights. And what they're able to see, and this is a map of the city of Toronto, for those who just may not be familiar. And you can see those that are darkest red compared to those that are lightest in color, that there's a great difference in the case rates of COVID-19. And in fact, the variation was up to 10 times the 10 times from the highest to the lowest neighborhood. And that's something I think I want everyone to sit with, right? And that's something that we sat with at the time, right? Where do we go from here? And how can we use this to move forward? Because it's important just to be able to see, yes, what is happening in a neighborhood. But each neighborhood has so many different types of communities, some more than others, right? That it's hard to group everyone all together and even determine that this perhaps it's housing, perhaps it's, education. Who knows exactly what's going on? And the other piece that we also want to understand is at the time that there are certain narratives that were happening, specifically as people that were focused on Black populations. There was a genetic or biological link to these COVID-19 hospitalizations and mortalities. And for those of us that definitely took a social determinants of health approach, we knew that that was not the case. And so we knew that there was going to have to be a next step, right? Something that we're going to have to do more. And so different types of data. And so we took a look and said, okay, these higher COVID-19 area rates, let's look at these neighborhoods and then try and see what different trends we're seeing across the board. And here you have a map of, the percentage of neighborhoods that have racialized populations. When we look at the neighborhoods that have higher rates of overcrowded housing, when we look at the neighborhoods that have higher rates of people or higher usage of public transit in those areas. And if we took a look at this last one with the dark oranges and reds demonstrating lack of primary care and the blues demonstrating an abundance of primary care, we can see that again, those same areas that had the higher rates of COVID-19 shared all of these characteristics. right? Which shows us that there's a serious need to respond to the pandemic in a very nuanced way. You know, it was called the great equalizer in the beginning, but I think that what this data demonstrates is actually there is a differential effect. And I don't think this is necessarily surprising, but it's important to the journey, right? To demonstrate how did we get there. And this changed a lot. In fact, to the point that public health units started to collect data in May of 2020. So London, Middlesex, and Peel and Toronto, all in quick succession, starting to understand that we need individual level sociodemographic data. We can't just have this, these findings come out and not do anything with it. And eventually got to the point that the province said, okay, well, if everyone is doing it, we have to change the laws and we'd want to have a provincial portal for this. So they did that. And as that individual level data became available, immediately, the people, at least here, started to analyze the information, right? Looking at the trends that are coming out and started to actually engage with different community organizations to figure out, is it mask drives that we need, right? Is it, health promotion materials? Is it like a language issue that people don't know what's going on? They had to sit, right? And that's from June, July, right? And then into August that they really took the time, short amount of time when you consider, but if you remember back to even that first year of the pandemic, every month felt very long and there was a need to respond in the moment. And so by August 2020 is when they started deploying the plans that they developed with communities based on the individual level sociodemographic data that they had available to them. And with that, they were actually able to decrease the disparities in Black communities here in Toronto. So what I'm about to demonstrate is actually the ratio, COVID-19 case ratios from Black populations compared to white populations. And if we look from June to August, you can see that there was an increase in the disparities that Black populations were experiencing with COVID-19. And if you remember, as I said, in August is when they started the equity response, right? And deploying things into communities. There were investments that were coming in from the city. And what did that do? Well, I'll show you. So the disparities decreased, right? When they went out and not just had the data available, right, and collected in, maybe they created a few graphs. No, they didn't do that. They went out and they said, okay, we have this data available and we need to talk with community members to figure out what's going on. And they were able to see those, that those disparities decreased. And mind you, remember that during that fall in 2020, there was a really big wave that came in, right? That second wave. So the number of COVID-19 cases as a whole were increasing, but still the disparities continued to decrease as they did this. And so what I hope to leave with people to get today, and I'll leave it on this slide, is that collecting sociodemographic data, individual level data, and disaggregating it can improve equity. And it's not just the nature of the data does this. It's the intentions behind collecting it and what you plan to do with it. There is a plan from the beginning. So it's always important to remember as we're collecting it, why? Who are we engaging with as we're going to do this? And how are we going to move forward? Because then with that, data becomes the tool that unlocks the future that we all try and work together and strive for Black populations. So with that, I will stop sharing. And I hope that was a helpful setup for the rest of this. Nancy, back to you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Jemal. And the real reason we wanted Jemal to go first is because there's some real tangible evidence that he and the Wellesley Institute brings in showing the collection of data and then how that has a relationship with equity responses. And I think that's so helpful because, again, as Jemal said when he wrapped up, you need to be collecting this data in an intentional way, but then also ensuring that you have a way forward to actually actioning the findings from the data. Because, of course, you don't just collect the data to do nothing with it. That has an impact with the trust that you build with communities. Something I wanted to flag, and then we'll go into the data from the SOBER report, is really the importance of getting nitty-gritty into understanding the diverse experiences of the Black population. We are not a monolith, as you know, on the line, and I think it's so important to recognize that while we have overarching experiences, perhaps when it comes to education, employment, discrimination, et cetera, that kind of binds us and creates like an overall shared experience, the experiences of Black women and Black men are not the same. And then when you factor in Black individuals from the 2S LGBTQ plus community, non-binary individuals, what about Black youth versus Black individuals who are older? And I'm going to walk through some data that shows the different languages that the Black community speaks or the different religions. So it's just important to say that when we're doing interventions and collecting data, we do want to be collecting it on the whole, but we also, where possible, want to be getting down into the nitty gritty so that we can employ solutions that work for the different Black populations that we have in Canada. And I'll also say that when collecting data, it's important to collect that quantitative data, the numbers, because that is really helpful in employing what Jemal showed, which is, oh, we have a peak, let's decrease it. But we also want to be trying to collect qualitative data, which are the stories and experiences that then shape or kind of try to create a narrative that helps understand those quantitative numbers. So just wanted to put both of those out there. Okay, so a little bit about the Black population, and this is all available in our SOBER report, but essentially we are growing. So in 2021, the Black population accounted for about 4.3% of the population, but it's expected to double by 2041. And you can see that the general population is this teal line, and the Black population is this teal line, and we've been growing since 2001 at kind of a high rate. And we're incredibly diverse. So, like I said, we're one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse populations in Canada. We have about over 450 different languages, most being French and English. About 59% of the Black population speaks English as their primary mother tongue, but almost 22% speak French. And I think that's an important distinction to make as well, because we need to be finding robust supports for our Black Francophone population. And you'll see that while a lot of the population lives in Ontario, there is a significant chunk that lives in Quebec as well. We have different religions. About 26% identify as Christian, but 12% identify as Muslim, and that's higher than the overall population. Interestingly, as well, we are a younger population than the average Canadian. The median age of the Black population in Canada is about 30.2, so 30-ish years of age, compared to 41 as the median age for the general population. And the reason I bring that up is because later in the presentation, we're going to be talking about pipeline experiences for Black youth and their experiences in education and how that segues into employment, leadership, and entrepreneurship. And so we also need to be finding robust supports way further down in the pipeline for Black youth, recognizing that we are a younger population than the general population. And then, like I said, we are growing. And interestingly, the Black population in the prairies has really grown significantly over the years at 7% and now 16%. So important to note that while we do have a big population in Ontario and Quebec, the Black population is also booming in other parts of Canada. So some good news, we are starting to see some of the disparities that existed in education dwindling, and I'll walk you through some of this data. So the teal line is the Black population, this kind of plummy color is the non-racialized population, and the pink color is the racialized population. And you'll see that while there are some differences in education rates, they're not so significant. So among those with a post-secondary certificate, diploma, or degree, the Black population is at 56.3. The non-racialized population is about 55.8. And the racialized population, so that's everyone minus Black who are racialized, is 60. So there is about a 4% difference between Black and racialized, but not super big as we were seeing previously. When you flip to no certificate, diploma, or degree, we do see that the Black community is a little bit higher, the highest among everyone at almost 17%. But again, if you look at the non-racialized population, 16.7, so only about a 0.2% difference. And then the racialized population is a little bit lower at 14.7. So I do want to say that while in this presentation, we're going to be walking through and talking about disparities, there is some good news that some of the gaps in education are dwindling, which I think is great. However, important to note that there are some pipeline experiences that do exist, and I do want to talk through some of the experiences of Black youth. And I think something that is helpful is you can think about young girls in STEM and the experiences that they have at quite a young age in being told that they're maybe not good at math and science and their perceptions of themselves in math and science. In fact, there's some data from EQAO from 2018, 2019 that showed that girls in grade three in Ontario said that they were good at math and science at a lesser rate than boys, even though testing didn't actually show that. And how does that then translate later on down the pipeline in young girls entering STEM fields in education and subsequently employment? And you can see that that narrative might be similar to Black individuals in other sectors or experiences. So I think that that's kind of like a good analogy to think of. But thinking about the Black population as young as they are in grade school and the kind of curriculum and system that we're offering to them. And I think it does start with the curriculum, and it's a balance between showing the disparities that Black individuals have experienced throughout history and how that has shaped present day experiences, while also making sure that we're showing positive narratives of Black individuals throughout history, because Black children really do need to see themselves represented in the individuals who have created Canada to what it is right now and all of the inventions and the entrepreneurs, et cetera. So it's a balance between the disparities in curriculum, but also the positives that we show in curriculum and how Black students see themselves. Another really important piece is the Black educators themselves, or the individuals who are instilling this knowledge in young kids. And we do have some data that shows that teachers actually really have a significant role in whether or not Black students feel welcomed and accepted and included in school and in their classrooms, and the importance of Black educators. So research shows that providing Black students with a Black teacher can bring a 13% increase in participation in post-secondary education, while decreasing the probability of not finishing high school by 29%. So you can see the kind of see it, be it impact that that really has. And we do know that there's some other data that shows high discipline rates among individuals who are perhaps not Black, et cetera. So it's to say that the role of the educator here is really important. But in order to do that, you need to be supporting Black educators and ensuring that they have mentorship, sponsorship, growth opportunities as well. And then I do want to highlight the segue between the very last point, disparities in employment, and how that connects to education. We do see that Black individuals have a higher rate of underemployment, which means that perhaps they do have post-secondary education, but they're not in roles or in jobs that require that kind of education. And they do have the highest rate of underemployment among different groups across Canada. So what can we do about it? It's really about supporting Black students from the very beginning of, like I said, the pipeline. And the first bit is really about collecting race-based data throughout the pipelines. So here we're talking about representation from, very early ages up into high school, up into post-secondary. Then you're thinking bachelor, master, PhD. I think it's also important to be collecting data on the individuals in school and whether they are actually obtaining roles in the workplace, in the workforce that match that skill level. It's also really important to be collecting disciplinary rates to understand whether Black students are being suspended or expelled at a higher rate than non-Black students, because we do have some data that shows that those kind of disparities exist. It's important to improve the representation of Black tutors and teachers across the whole ecosystem because of that see it, be it, but also in supporting Black teachers as well so that they have opportunities to grow, be mentored, and advance into leadership roles. Like I said, we want to be developing a culturally robust and responsive curriculum that shows the disparities, but also shows the positives so that Black youth see themselves reflected in the fabric of what makes Canada great. And then, of course, a significant portion is really about training educators so that they're aware of what anti-Black racism looks like, how it manifests in the curriculum they're teaching, and how they manage their classrooms, so that they can be doing better. But all of these bullet points really hinge for a large part on the collection of this race-based data so that you can understand your gaps so that you can improve. Okay, so here we're at employment. I will say that the unemployment rate of Black workers between the ages of 25 to 54, which is kind of the main base of the economy, was at About 11% in January of 2025, and this is an increase from about 9% from earlier that year. So we do see that the unemployment rate for Black individuals is up, and this is higher than the average, the general population. The general population's unemployment rate is just under 6%. So we do see that gaps exist there. I will say that it's interesting to look at the data to see where Black individuals are kind of concentrated in the kinds of jobs that they're doing. But because Statistics Canada has such a long list of different jobs, I know that the data or the numbers is a little bit low. But we do see that Black individuals tend to be working in manufacturing and utility jobs and the health sector, which is really interesting. And we have some information on Black nurses if you're curious. But what Statistics Canada is able to do as well is you can kind of group these together because the data points are mutually exclusive. So if you wanted to kind of group all the science ones together and the arts-based ones together and the health-based ones together, you could do that to get an overall picture. But it is interesting to be able to see where the Black community finds themselves in terms of different kinds of roles and sectors. And we do see that, interestingly, they are underrepresented in management at about 2.4. I will say that the experiences, and I feel like I don't have to share too much on for those of you on the line because you're aware of the experiences with discrimination of Black people in employment, but I will go through it because I do think it's important. And this is all again from the SOBR report, but it's from a study that we did with the Environics Institute. And it showed the experiences of discrimination from 2020 to 2023 among the different racialized populations. And what you can see here is that 47% of respondents who are Black indicated that they faced some kind of discrimination or unfair treatment in the workplace. And this is new data. And I think what's important here is that this kind of discrimination, as many of you know, can be overt. It's the intentional act of denying people opportunities, particularly leadership roles. But it's also covert. It's the ways that Black individuals are excluded from formal mentorship opportunities, also informal networks. So when everyone goes out for a drink after work, or everyone goes golfing, or they all convene over the latest hockey scores, et cetera. And that's where opportunities are shared. We're seeing that Black individuals tend to be excluded from these informal networks. It's also about the ways that we treat Black people in the workplace that are called microaggressions. And I know that even though the name suggests that they're small, they're not. It's the ways in which we kind of liken Blackness to unprofessionalism, the way we're surprised that Black people are articulate when they're giving a presentation, the way we ask Black women to change their hair to be more professional, the way Black people have to, in general, code switch in the workplace. So I think there's many qualitative stories that exist, but I do think that also this quantitative data is really important to highlight. And then if we go deeper into intersectional data, we see differences in the Black population between Black men and Black women. So women is this plumb line and men is this hot pink line. And when we're looking at discrimination in the workplace, Black women at 38% have a higher rate of experiencing discrimination than Black men, and then the total. So again, really important in hitting home on what Jemal was talking about of overall collecting data for the Black population, but disaggregating it so we understand those gendered nuances. I will say that there is a link between discrimination and mental health, and this again comes from the SOBR report and some of our work with the Environics Institute. Black respondents who reported experiencing workplace discrimination were more likely to describe their mental health as poor or fair compared to those who had not faced discrimination. And we know that discrimination in the workplace takes a toll on your physical and mental health. It leads to burnout, lack of support, and an overall retention issue. And among Black respondents, Canadian-born individuals were significantly more likely to having reported experiencing discrimination than Black immigrants, which I thought was an interesting significant, and I would have thought perhaps it was the other way around. But again, when you collect this data, you might find things that you didn't expect that then shape your insights in a different way. I'll also say that we do see income gaps stemming from these experiences of discrimination and general employment experiences. And I will bring up something interesting from our report from the Black Muslim population. My colleagues can put it in the chat, but we did a report from on the socioeconomic status of the Black Muslim population that showed that the Black Muslim population is overrepresented among those earning less and underrepresented among those earning more. And only about 27% of the Black Muslim population earns more than 100 grand a year, compared to 44% of the general population. That's a huge gap, 27% to 44%. So it's to say that this has impacts then on the generational wealth that the Black community is receiving, right? Okay, so what can we do about this? And then I'll talk a little bit about leadership, and then we'll go over to Cassandra to talk about entrepreneurship. So it really starts with, again, collecting the data to understand the disparities and using it in a way that's thoughtful and significant. And that can be used to then create opportunities through networking and job placement hubs that connect Black job seekers and with employers through dedicated intermediaries. Sector-specific bridging programs, mentorship programs, digital literacy workshops, wage subsidy programs, and work-integrated learning. So when you have this data, you can kind of see where the pain points are and then find solutions for them. And I think this would also be really helpful as we go back to this, the stat that I showed previously on the underemployment for Black individuals as well. A little bit about Black leadership in Canada. So this is updated data, and what I want to say is that in Toronto, if you've maybe come to one of our presentations in the past, you would have seen that Toronto had quite a big gap between the Black population and the general population when it comes to board roles. But actually, that gap has closed significantly. So you see that about 7.9% of the population is Black and 6.4% are in board roles. But these gaps still exist across different cities in Canada. So if we go back to Montreal, you see that 7.9% of the population in Montreal is Black, but they only have about 4.6% of board roles. We can look again also at Ottawa, 7.6 to 4.9. So while some of the gaps from previous years like 2020 have closed, we do see that there are some gaps that exist across Canada that we should be mindful of. And what I will also highlight is a large percentage of companies within the S&P TSX index have no Black leaders on their boards or executive teams. In fact, 81.3% have no Black leaders on their boards, and 85.1% have no Black individuals on their executive teams. And when we think about intersectionality, first of all, there's a number of reasons why Black people are not getting into these leadership roles. You can think of the lack of mentorship, sponsorship, formal networks, informal networks, microaggressions, discrimination. But also, I want to talk a little bit about retention and what we're calling the glass cliff, specifically for Black women, and how Black women are often promoted into roles at a time of uncertainty and risk, where the roles are undersupported, underfunded, and undervalued. And that leads to a retention issue where they ultimately leave. So again, it's important to be collecting that disaggregated data to understand what I'll call the broken rungs are. Maybe it's that Black people are not getting into management roles, they're not getting into senior management roles, et cetera. But then you also need to be collecting that data to understand if Black individuals are rising the ranks and leaving. I will pass it over to Cassandra to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, and then she'll pass it over to Nadine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nancy. Now, it's interesting as you go through a story is being told and you see it being leveled one on top of the other, and there's no big surprises as you're going through this. You've heard from Jemal about the community data and sort of what it means when you collect what it looks like. You've heard on the education side what it looks like. You've heard on the employment side. When we look at the entrepreneurship, and most of us, we know someone in our community, we grew up in small communities where we saw the building of entrepreneurship, but it's not surprising to see whether we were taking the data in 2016, whether we're taking the data in 2021, whether we take the data in 2024, we do see that the Black population has a lower rate of entrepreneurship. Surprise, surprise. It's nice to see when we looked at 2016, we start to see it go up and it's like, oh my God, things are happening. But guess what? That was at a time when there were many supports coming out. We were actually the employment, because jobs and businesses closed down, people had to start particular businesses. And so all of a sudden, the idea that was on the side, they said, oh, we can run with it. They were starting to see it. But guess what? We're now in 2024. We see that number gone right back down again. So we have to say, what is causing that? What are the things that are causing this to continue the numbers to be low? And what can we do to actually increase the numbers? So those are the things we want to think about as we look at entrepreneurship, because everything you've heard today is building on how do we build the wealth in our community? And this is all driven by whether it be education and entrepreneurship. Take me to the next slide, please, Nancy. Now, most of you, when you think of Black-owned businesses, there's certain attributes that come to mind when you think of these, okay? And for sure, and even if I talk to some large-scale corporate businesses who do business with smaller Black institutions, the first thing they'll say, oh, there must be small. Oh, they don't have the capacity to deliver. And then the small, then they go, when they're small, there's definitely smaller contracts are in line with. And for the most part, when you tend to see that, you tend to see Black entrepreneurs who tend to be either single individuals and or have less than 5 employees that they're working with. So these are very, small to micro-sized business that we're looking at. We also talk about how much do they earn when you think about that. And so depending on your size, depending on the industry that you're in, your ability to bid on RFPs and win RFPs, we're seeing that the Black business owners earn on average 56,000 compared to 65 for other racialized and 99 for white men. Think of that. I mean, you're in the same business and you're going from 99 to 65 to 56. We definitely have particular issues out there that we're looking at. Also, think about the attributes of what particular industries are Black-owned businesses in. And the thing that comes to mind, and when the researcher said transportation and warehousing, that is a very traditional focus when you think about that. We're now, when you read the newspaper, you're looking at everything. We're looking at renewals, we're looking at greening, we're looking at cybersecurity, we're looking at AI. Where do we find the Black-owned businesses? We're in the smaller traditional areas. And so whether it be 34% in transportation and warehousing, then you're followed by, you're dropping down to 13% real estate and rental leasing. So again, there's some very traditional areas that's not where the market's going. But again, that ties into why we see some of the lower income and why we see lower numbers. Take me to the next slide, please. Now, we've talked about sort of, when we talked about the income and sort of the numbers of businesses, but think about some of the barriers. And this has come out time and time again, that when we've talked to women business entrepreneurs in particular, what they said are their prime barriers. This 79% saying access to financing. So when we think about that, that's your ability to obtain loans. That means when they look at your credit rating, when they look at what assets you have, that is big an impact. That's impacting your ability to get funding to run your business. That is huge when you talk about, I've started a business, now how do I grow my business? What does that look like? We also talked about when we did the survey, we asked them about, what are the other barriers? 70% said access to equity or capital. So if a financing allows me to just start to run the business, if I'm trying to grow my business or expand, that's the equity or capital. And so if I have problems getting a loan, it's even more of a problem for the next step up. These are considerable areas for Black women entrepreneurs as they grow their businesses. 65% of the survey said cost of borrowing was a barrier. I mean, now we have other facilities out there, whether it be FACE, whether it be Black Opportunity Fund. There's other areas that are putting funding out there. But again, we have to look at, is it accessible? And are you ready for that? What does that look like to be able to meet the cost of that? These are all issues. And the smaller number, just let me finish, the smaller number, the 28%, it's good that that's down to 28% because we're trying to get as much information out so people know where to get help for their business. That's essential. I have a business. Where do I go? So we're trying to make sure that's effective and out there for people to learn from. So take me to the next slide, please. Now, when you start your business, there's a number of factors why people start their business. If you heard all the themes going through it, some of this can be exclusion from traditional employment. You're just going through, there's nobody's going to hire you, or you're getting jobs that do not advance you. Or, in some cases, I know not people that they got to a particular ceiling and the director's roles, the higher level roles they kept applying, they weren't getting them. And so when you see that, what happens to that, that's a push that moves a lot of our Black entrepreneurs, oh, let me start my own. But the pull factor is also when you're seeing opportunities that are out there that are not being fed by other businesses, and you said, I can do that. There's an opportunity there that I have the skills to be able to do that. And so we've seen some of that, and that was evident during the COVID time as well, when we see businesses come out and say, hey, guess what? I want to be able to run that. There's no one's doing this right now. And those are all key factors that allow the Black entrepreneurs to come to the forefront. Now, what I do want to take you through is, while these are all factors that are driving it, the other thing, when I have a business, I can run a business, but if I'm not being successful in bidding on RFPs, that is a big problem. So we have a lot of resources out here trying to drive business, help you get your market plan, help you get your business plan, all those things, but who helps you get into the supply chain? That becomes a bigger issue, and we need a lot more of that going on. So take me to the next slide, please. So when we talk about inclusive procurement, and those of you might have heard it in terms of You'll hear supplier diversity used to be a term that's used, and we don't use it as much, hear it as much in the US anymore. You'll still hear it in Canada. We hear social procurement. Government uses that, under which they talk about inclusive procurement, and you'll hear organizations talk inclusive procurement in particular. And that means is being proactive to go out there and identify those previously not at the table or not in the supply chain and pull them in, because we know there's innovative companies out there. We know there's ideas. How do we get them inside? So it's important when organizations intentionally, and I use that word intentionally, are inclusive in their procurement. Because what that means is they will be looking for Black-owned businesses to actually say, if I do an assessment of my supply chain of all the suppliers I work with, I don't have anyone, or I have a less than 1%, I've had less. So then they say, and I'm working in traditional areas that I might be in a particular area of Toronto. Why aren't I using Black suppliers in this area? They run businesses. So they're being intentional, going out to look for Black businesses. When you hire Black businesses or they win the RFP, guess what? They hire people who look like them. They reinvest in the community. That's part of the importance of inclusive procurement. It also, part of this means you're able to strengthen networks. So you're able to find businesses who know other business, who can refer businesses. You heard Nancy talk earlier about mentorship opportunities. As a business person, as you start to grow, you're able to reach out to another young business or another fledgling business and give them some of the knowledge and wisdom and help direct them as they grow their business. This is all about the innovation and efficiency. What happens in small businesses without deep pockets, they tend to be very innovative. They tend to be able to find a way without all the ways and means that instinctively businesses are like, how did they come up with that idea? Because necessity creates that idea. That's important. And that's what you see in these small fledgling businesses who suddenly have a way to be able to do things. All in all, the importance of inclusive procurement is it promotes generational wealth. It positions us to hire people who look like us, to reinvest in our community, to get our children educated, and actually to have educational wealth. What in some cases our parents weren't able to do to us, but what they did was open the door to education. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Nadine, who can overlay on top of that.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. As I'm listening to the conversation, in terms of what Nancy said and in terms of what Jemal said, I just think of all the women entrepreneurs and all the men, of course, as well, that needs to hear this conversation. Because what's interesting is that we jump into a business because of all the reasons that we discussed. And then we hit that roadblock and that barrier for how do we get the resources. I was in the United States on a program, and one of the things they did is they actually had a unit that they brought into the communities, because they said if we want true access and equitable access for entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, they can't leave their restaurant to come down to our facility and get the training. So they actually have a unit that goes out to them. So it's just interesting hearing that. I think all of this great knowledge, and I think I'm starting at the end, but the takeaway is, how do we get this out to all the individuals who need it? I think that is the biggest takeaway. So I really appreciate being invited to this conversation. It's an essential one, not just because of what's at stake, but because of what's possible. I'm here at the United Nations in a room at the United Nations Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. And because this is not just only a moment, it's really a movement, a movement that is committed to justice, dignity, opportunity for people of African descent around the world. And it's really central that the vision here is economic power, and the data lays that foundation and that path for us to follow. Because without the data, how do we see all the barriers to get us to economic power? So the State of Black Economics report it's not just, I don't see it as just as a data, it's really our mirror, it's a mirror to our mandate. We're not just here to describe disparities, we're here to dismantle them. And one of the most powerful ways to do that, I think, is by investing in Black entrepreneurship. So, Jemal spoke about how necessity is the parent of invention, especially during COVID. But for many Black entrepreneurs like myself, that necessity, was already there. It was long before the pandemic. It came from, systemic racism in the workplace. Having credentials, that I've heard from some of my colleagues, having credentials that were dismissed when arriving in Canada, and from being, repeatedly passed over at work for promotions and not being told, in subtle or not so subtle ways, being told that they don't belong. I think about a woman that I met who was an engineer with about 20 years experience from Nigeria, and she moved to Canada only to be told that, start over at an entry-level job. And, she didn't do that. She went into entrepreneurship, and now she owns a construction company and is doing phenomenally well. So those are some of the issues. And, Nancy, you spoke about employment and leadership gaps. And, again, those gaps is, why my friend, the engineer, started her own company. And so, Cassandra, your statement about, procurement has to be inclusive, but it's intentional. Like that is such an important part of that inclusivity as well. And so, in practice, what does all this mean? So, here's my first slide. Let's look at what the data reveals. So when we talk about building pathways and inclusion at every stage, what the slide shows is that it maps the entrepreneurial journey from ideation to becoming global leaders. It shows how small ventures really evolve through stages. You have the ideation stage, the early incubation, scaling, which, from what I've seen, scaling is sort of the hardest thing, because we talked about those issues with the loan and the credit score, and, how do you get from, your 100,000 to 500,000 and then that big scale, because the bank requires a lot of things in order to scale. And some of those things we just don't have it, and I speak for myself, as I built a business and was scaling. And, finally, global leadership. So the diagram at the bottom emphasizes how lots of small bets must be supported, and how we must select and scale promising ideas and then linking them to investment rounds, all with intentional funding and support at each stage. So, inclusion must be designed into every stage of entrepreneurship, not just at the beginning, not just once because someone became successful. If we only support entrepreneurs at the end of the journey, we really lose the brilliance that never gets a chance to grow. When I think about the other vaccine, I think of the other COVID vaccine. There were two, and one of them was designed by a Black woman, and it escapes my head now. Imagine that if we never supported that entrepreneur. Look at what's missing from our society if she did not have the opportunity to grow. So those are some of the things that we have to look at. And, when we look at, for an example, we often fund pilot programs or, MVPs, but then we don't provide the bridge to the next step, like the access to scale up capital, or procurement opportunities or, export markets. How many times have I heard a person say, I want to export, but I don't know how, I don't have the money. I don't have the knowledge to do that. So all of those are just some of the challenges. And then if we could go into the next slide. So how are we supporting this journey? Let's look at what the infrastructure that's already existing and where the gaps are. So when we look at Black entrepreneurship supports, like here's a snapshot of national supports. We have FACE with the $260 million loan fund, ecosystem partners, microloans, mentorship, training, and procurement programs. Support systems, truly are the backbone of entrepreneurial success. We need it from day one, and we need it all the way through the cycle of our businesses. But, to what Cassandra said is that the access is there, but it's not sometimes. It's just when you mentioned the cost of the loan, the accessibility, the navigating the path to those loan forms and so forth, and you still hit a roadblock because, when you look at those C characteristics of lending, the character of the credit and all of those things, that continues to be a challenge. And so, and also, with procurement programs, though that continues to be a challenge. So, support systems truly are the backbone of entrepreneurial success. I know what it is. I work with women every day where they need that support. For Black entrepreneurs, those support systems, sometimes it truly feels like the door's locked. It does. Right now, I have a client who is looking at getting financing, and she's been in a very tough industry for many years. And although she's proven her male counterparts, they have all the funding and all of those things, but yet she's still struggling, 10 years in an industry that's very challenging, that not many people make it in 10 years. And her paperwork is just phenomenal, but still she's not able to get that type of funding. So I will now move to the next slide. And so, infrastructure is only one part of the equation. But we also have the challenge, the default image of who gets to be called an entrepreneur in the first place. So when you Google, entrepreneur, this is what you see. I don't see myself. I don't see Cassandra. I don't see Nancy. We don't see ourselves in these pictures. So it exposes how the dominant image of the entrepreneur is white and male, and tech-centered, excluding many by default. But, sometimes I wonder, is it really by default or the system is just built that way? We cannot build an inclusive economy if people don't see themselves as part of that economy. We just can't. What are we going to tell our little girls and boys as they look to us? How can I be that person in these spaces? So studies show that banks ask men about growth potential, but ask women about risk when they're getting financing. So now layer that with race, and it becomes clear, that Black women are questioned even before they're supported. The stereotypes of who looks like an entrepreneur is truly costing us innovation. And so, I think, we have to redefine who's seen as investable. Financial institutions, investors, and incubators, we really have to challenge our internal narratives and change how they evaluate Black women founders. And I speak from those strong experiences. So as I bridge to the next slide, it's not just about perception, it's about visibility, visibility of people. If people can't see us, they won't support us at all, And so the importance of visibility in reshaping who's seen as an entrepreneur has to be paramount, because if you can see it, you can be it. That is the narrative. So many instances I hear young women say, oh, I saw that person do this job. Now I know that I can do that. So, we have to have more of these examples, because when a young girl sees just white males only founders celebrated, she won't see ourselves. Like, I have a little granddaughter, and we try to show her all the different spectrum of different things, because it's not just about inspiration. It's about access to opportunity. And if you don't see yourself in a space, you're not going to imagine that you too can be in that space. And so I know that Nancy, I think the next slide is yours, but I just want to sort of end cap that with the fact that the data. What excites me about the report is that the data makes it very clear that Black entrepreneurship in Canada and Black entrepreneurs continue to face significant barriers. So we talked about self-employment rates are lower for racialized groups. We talked about 79% report barriers to financing. Access to capital continues to be a major obstacle. And, as I sit here at the UN, and the conversations that they had this morning in the opening session was really about the access to capital. It continues to be an ongoing conversation. What is the call to action? What are we going to do to ensure that we improve on these numbers? I just feel like we're not getting there. But I'm excited about the report. We have a system that isn't broken. It's a system that was never built for us, right? So for many of us, entrepreneurship, it's not a dream, it's a necessity. Like I had to become a businesswoman. And it happens because traditional doors were closed. And when credentials are dismissed and leadership potential is overlooked, we look to entrepreneurship. And that is why inclusion must be built into every step, as I showed from that one chart, from ideation to global leadership. And so we need data-driven solutions for seed funding, for inclusive procurement, representation in the narrative, and policies with real accountability. So this report doesn't just highlight the barriers. It charts a path forward, and it gives us the data and the urgency and the opportunity to build an economy where Black entrepreneurs thrive. And so at the United Nations, over and out, the time really to act is now. The urgency is now, as the session leader said today. And with this sober report, hopefully we'll have sober days, because we now have the blueprint in our hands.
Amazing. Okay, thank you so much, Nadine. So I'll just give a little bit of an overview of the way forward, but then I'll pass it right over to our panelists because I have some questions for them, and I think some of you do as well. So really the way forward is about taking the data that we've spoken about throughout the last hour, as well as other data that exists in the ecosystem, and trying to understand what solutions we can come up with from a societal, organizational, and individual level. Because what's really key here is understanding that the disparities that Black communities have or experience exist at all of these different levels. The high level policies that we have at a government level, et cetera, trickle over into the expectations of organizations. The policies that organizations put in place have impacts for individuals and so forth. So, as Jemal said in the very beginning, you want to be collecting this data, but you want to be doing something with it. Data that just lives on a shelf is data that lives on a shelf. And so, a couple of things that we're doing at a very high level is legislation as well as voluntary codes and norms. In Canada, we have quite robust legislation that supports anti-discrimination and anti-racism. We have our employment equity legislation. We have Accessible Canada Act, Bill C-25, which really focuses on racialized and equity deserving groups in leadership roles, pay equity legislation, and of course, our Charter of Rights and our different human rights codes that exist across the country. And really understanding the barriers and disparities that exist from the data has helped shape much of this legislation. You can think of employment equity that really focuses on the disparities that exist, as well as Bill C-25, and how data has been used to understand the kind of mechanisms that we need to combat barriers at the leadership level, but you also have some of these voluntary codes that are coming into play. A lot of the data that we've seen throughout this presentation has been really instrumental in developing some of these efforts, like the 50-30 challenge, which focuses on gender equity and the equity of equity deserving groups, or the increased diversity of equity deserving groups in leadership roles, so on boards and in leadership teams, as well as efforts like the 30% Club and the Black North Initiative, which are also voluntary codes that encourage organizations to pledge to increase diversity in their leadership spaces. So you take that data, but you ensure it doesn't live on the shelf. You ensure that it's used to inspire other organizations to change their leadership structures. And then you continue to use it to understand who's not at the table so that you can be making strides. Nadine spoke really well about challenging stereotypes and celebrating success, so I won't go too much into this. But what I will also say, and I think this is a good segue to our panelists, is that collecting data at the organizational level exists across the whole gamut of organizational processes, from the very top, so the tone at the top and the leadership and strategy that you develop, as well as who sits at your leadership tables. Then trickling down into your human resource processes, including how you're actually marketing opportunities, who has access to job postings, are the postings accessible, what networks you're using, what is the selection process, are there biases embedded within it, is your selection panel diverse, etc. To your values and culture, how are you celebrating and supporting Black individuals in your workplace? What kind of mentorship opportunities are you creating? What kind of sponsorship opportunities, professional development and upskilling opportunities, even down to the cultural celebrations that you promote in your organization, the food you serve at events, et cetera. Is it halal? Is it not, et cetera? Like that's all necessary for creating an inclusive workplace environment. Diversity across your value chain and really thinking about who sits at the table when you're coming up with your marketing strategies, when you're developing new services or products or programs for the wider community, and whether they work or they don't work for the Black community. What percentage of your consumers or the ecosystem that you support is the Black community? And then thinking about the philanthropic dollars that your organization provides to the community. Does it go to Black-owned businesses or Black-led initiatives? How are you reaching down and supporting Black youth to combat some of those pipeline issues that we talked about? So measuring and tracking EDI and anti-Black racism is really foundational to all of the different levels that exist within an organization. And collecting that disaggregated data can help you understand the disparities so that you can put in place action-oriented solutions. So I will stop here and we will go to our panel question, and then we'll take some questions for the audience. And I think we're right on time. So like I've said throughout the whole presentation, we've really focused on the importance of collecting data, making sure that the data is accessible and user-friendly, et cetera. And we know that these are kind of trying times where we've seen that there is pushback against EDI initiatives and initiatives to address anti-Black racism. And I wanted to ask the panelists where organizations where can they develop strategies, or how can they develop strategies? What kind of strategies do they need to really stay the course and advance EDI and anti-racism? And where does data collection and using that data and leverage it fall into these strategies? So kind of a big question, but you have a lot of time to answer it. So I think we'll start with Jemal, then we'll go to Cassandra and then Nadine.
Sure. Yeah, I will give you all the information you need, every strategy. You won't need anything else after this. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, one thing that I think of, and this is actually a reflection I had from one of my studies, talking to someone who was trying to collect and use data in their own organization. And in that story, they were a public health unit who was trying to, collect race-based data in different units. But part of collecting and using it, they wanted to make sure that communities were also owners of that data, right? Community governance, so that they can decide what the best use is. And so they had to, though, figure out how their data is just managed, period, right? Who's the owner of information? Where do their data sets live? And as they asked all of these questions in all the different divisions, they realized there is no standardized process already, just for data alone, not even getting into race-based data. And that was a place of concern for the institution, right? As they started asking all these questions, and now this is available to them. This is all sensitive. And that is where then the drive for needing better data, a learning system, right? Better data governance as a whole came in. And because now the leaders have to respond. They're responsible every day for delivering services. And this isn't just in a healthcare context, right, in this case, but if we apply it to many different other types of organizations, if you're collecting information, you're responsible in so many different ways for making sure that it's private and it's secure. And then for us now to interrogate, how do we make sure our data is safe and secure? You're prompting people to start thinking about data not just as something that we just standardly have, but as an asset that deserves to be protected. And so as that institution started their journey of improving their data systems, quite naturally, they already had a focus on race-based data themselves, like that specific team. Since they were leading the effort and now getting the resources to lead this and coordinate across the institution, it helped them grow, right, and keep going. So all this to say that I do always think it's important to keep, if it's race we're talking about right now, keep race in the conversation. I'm not necessarily a fan of thinking like, we can mention it later because you may not get the opportunity to bring that in. So we need to be very clear about what we're trying to do, but we also need to reframe this as a benefit for the whole institution, for how we just practice information as a whole. And the other part that I suppose I just would say, in addition to this, that I always think is so important, is trying to identify strategies for support for those leading this work. Right? If we're thinking that institutional, organizational lens, it's great, but also people who are, doing this work need safe spaces to have conversations with peers in other different organizations. So allowing them to enter rooms and network with other, staff members or employees or even entrepreneurs, right? People who are engaging with the same people to say, this is my experience, what is yours? And being able to have that safe space, right, to network across, I always think is important, because no social movement happened by a single individual, by a single person leading alone. Everything happens together, and so we need to think together. And that, I feel, is even the ethos of both of the points I'm trying to make, right? Race-based data isn't just about race-based data, it's actually about data as a whole, right? And now we're just bringing race into it. And secondly, too, as those of us who are trying to lead this work, we're not a person, we are people, right? And peoples. So also we need to think of how to support the peoples, right? As we're trying to do this together. So maybe that's just where I would start. And that's where I would come in from based on my experience, but I'd love to hear from the others.
Okay, Cassandra, so what are some key strategies that leaders can use to continue to advance EDI and anti-racism?
Okay, first of all, I'd say this work we're doing is not easy. This work is actually very difficult. So what has come about now is that, guess what? It's when, the rubber hits the road. We've had this supplier diversity, we've had DEI, and while we've been trying to move the yardsticks, we haven't seen as much advancement as we want to. And so on the other side, we have people saying that, DEI, and they're talking about DEI does not equal merit or excellence. And I would challenge that entirely. So I love when Jemal said, don't walk away from the word. What we should be looking at is well, race or ethnicity or diversity gets you to the door. It does not get you through the door. We are focused on merit. We are focused on excellence. And that's what we want our organizations and our governments to continue doing that. When we look at the Canadian government, they are actually looking at a social procurement policy, which indeed focuses on diversity, which indeed focuses on people who are not otherwise at the table. And so they're still working on what does that look like. We want to hold them accountable to that because as a population, we're made up of all diverse groups. We should be part and parcel of what's going on, what they procure, what they buy, how they fix things. We need to be part of that. And so therefore we need them to do that, but we also need them to be tracking that. Intentionality doesn't necessarily lead to the end results we need. You need to have a mirror up. What are you doing? You need to be transparent on what are my goals? How am I getting through? Am I getting the suppliers in the right areas? So we need governments to actually start looking at. When you think of the Canadian government, our biggest spend is probably in defense. Do we have anybody out there? We talked about we have logistics, we have, real estate. We need to get people in the right places so we're taking advantage of that, or we need them backed up to corporations as a subcontractor or tier 1, tier 2 to large scale so they get in that. On the other side, for organizational side, I want us to say we need to make sure we are building that inclusive organizational culture. So what does that mean? That means that the DEI training continues. That means the resource groups are out there, but we also are building diversity into the RFPs. We are using language like that in the RFPs. We are breaking large contracts into smaller contracts so we can get people all across the country involved in what's going on. We need to have, and to sure, not only do we break it up, we actually start to prepare these smaller suppliers by having pre-bid sessions and informing them what's coming down the pipe. City of Toronto has FIFA coming in 2026. Is anybody ready for that? We need to have suppliers who know that's out there and are prepared to bid on these opportunities. So that's my corporate side, but I'm not going to let my diverse suppliers off either. Because from a diverse supplier, do you have your own inclusive procurement policy in place? Are you hiring? Are you buying from people who look like you? If you're in a door, are you bringing someone else in the door as you're bidding on an opportunity? Are you mentoring others? There's roles for all of us to play, so we can't fold our arms and say it's not working for us. What are we doing to advance this as we go forward? Okay.
Okay, Nadine.
I love it. I just want to say, speak, sister and brother. So I'm the marketer, so I'm going to come up with a story. I have a story, okay? I always have stories, all right? I was buying Easter bun from one year, and I went to one of my very successful Black entrepreneur friends, and she says, Nadine, I'm going to get you a bun and cheese for Easter. Now, if you're Jamaican, you know what bun and cheese for Easter is all about, with fish. And so we go to Gibbo's West Indian store, and at Gibbo's West Indian store, he doesn't have the bun and cheese, okay? And I'm livid. She says, Nadine, Gibbo does not have the credit line to stock the 20 bun and cheese we want from him in this instant. He cannot stock his store to sell to us. So we need to go and give Gibbo the money, and then Gibbo is going to go and get the bun and cheese and sells it to us. Right now, in every world, this is like crazy. Why would you do that? Move on to someone else. But the fundamental thing of what she understood is that we're not all coming from the same playing field. And if we want to make progress, that Gibbo is going to advance and build his business, we have to understand the challenges that he has. And we have to make adjustments for waiting. Yes, it took an hour to wait while he, got the money and then went to the bank. And that's the other problem. They wanted to hold his check, and he's telling them, I got a customer with a big order, right? And so that's one of the things we have to look at. It comes from a place of understanding. So I want to start there. And so, when we talk about pushback, a lot of has been said already, right? But leaders, they have to double down on clarity, and courage and consistency when advancing and advocating for equity, diversity, and inclusion and anti-racism. That's the thing. So first, the actions has to be in data. In law, they say res ispa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself, right? And so when we look at anchoring your actions in data, it quantify disparities, and we can track the progress, and we can let the numbers speak. Lead with the numbers. When we write a proposal for someone, we say, what do you want to accomplish? We're not starting with the fluff first. We're starting with the numbers, because when you start with the numbers, you can measure it. And when you can measure it, you can know what? We moved the needle or we didn't. And if we didn't move the needle, we can say, hey, we said we were going to do X and we didn't do it. There's no blame. There's no blame. Maybe we just need to a pivot to adjust the formula of what it is we're doing. So when we lead with a number, that's the first. Second, I talked about GIBOs, and that's the lived experience. So, what is the lived experience of the individuals? So we have to look at that. We have to look at the ongoing spaces of marginalized voices to be heard and integrated into the decision making. I bet you that if at these roundtables, with the banks and so forth, I bet you if they had GIBO into their roundtable, they're not going to have him in. He's not worth anything to them. But I bet you they would have a different perspective in terms of what we need, right? And that data would then mean something to them. So, we have to look at how we embed EDI into the DNA of our organizations. And Cassandra, you spoke to that, and Jemal, you spoke to that. We have to normalize it. So it's not this, oh, it's a surprise, it's happening today. Once a year, oh, there's a training, isn't that wonderful? That's not how it is. We bathe every day, we brush our teeth every day. That should be how that EDI is normalized. This conversation, this standard of excellence, and this data is normalized into our everyday language. And then finally, when we look at moments of resistance, we have to stay the course. This is not an easy conversation. We've had, I'm 57 years old, and this conversation has been had by my parents and beyond and beyond. It'll probably be another one. I'm 99 and more. This conversation will be had. But how can we, look at, we stay the course, we recognize what is happening, and we look at progress. And I think small progress is good. Listen, I'm good with small progress as long as we're moving forward. And, I was at an event last year, and it was at a big airport in the United States. And one of the things they had as part of their diversity policy was that if the vendors had a performance review, and if they had to show how many contracts they handed out to different range of individuals, because to Cassandra's point, the person who needs a low dollar value account of $25,000, and for some people it's like a big thing, and they still don't know how to manage that. FIFA's coming. How many of our people are able to take advantage of the opportunity? So what happens is the same big people get those big contracts, and there's no learning for anyone else. So I think we have to look at those solutions and add the outcome of what we want for those organizations. How many contracts did you hand out? What does that look like? And we have to measure it. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone's insights and answers. And I'll just wrap this up, and then we'll go into some questions. But I really hope that everyone found the session insightful. I know that in some cases, data doesn't always exist or isn't always disaggregated properly, if at all. And in some cases, it isn't always accessible or readable to individuals who maybe aren't so familiar with data. And so I think hopefully this sober report was helpful for everyone on the line in presenting some accessible data that you can leverage to develop, data-driven actions for change. So we'll go through some questions in the Q&A. I saw one that was really interesting. It's from Pauline. They say, great insights. Thank you for the info. My name is Pauline, the current executive director of KWICA, Kenya Women in Canada Association. Their first question is, how can data from this report be used to influence real policy change at the municipal and federal levels, particularly for supporting Black-led organizations? So we'll start there. And do any of the panelists want to take that one up?
Yeah, I don't mind starting with that. We hear this amazing conversation, Cassandra, Nancy, the Diversity Institute, and Jemal. We cannot be the only architects of change. I don't know how many people are on this webinar, but I think we have to share the report. We have to go to our government. We have to go to our stakeholders. We have to have voices that champions the report as well as us. That's the one simple thing that I can say.
Cassandra, yeah.
Let me overlay on top of that. municipalities and governments are influenced by others. So again, we know the city of Toronto does this. You've got your report out. You're going to share it with municipalities. You're going to share it with provincial entities, federal government as well. I mean, I said it's sponsored, so you're going to get. So we know the federal government's doing something. We want to get some of them at the table, have them talk to others, have the city talk to other municipalities, use that because they tend to leave. No one wants to jump in the pool by themselves, or is that in too deep? Let someone else. City of Toronto's been there. City of Brampton's doing that. There's others who are doing that. Learn from that and start to sort of build that to bring back to the municipalities you're dealing with. So have them talk to each other. That peer group listens to each other. They might hear from us, but when they hear their own saying that we're using that data, that's helped us identify gaps in our process. You'll be surprised as to what they'll do. So offer them the report if they don't already have it, connect them into the Diversity Institute, create a round table that brings more discussion to the table. Those are the types of things you want to start that fire burning so people know where to access and to have that conversation.
Yeah, no. Maybe what I would add is I feel it's always important to keep attention to issues that already are existing. Often in this news cycle, perhaps a case of discrimination will come up on a Toronto Star article, Global Mail, and then fizzle out, whether it's discrimination in the workplace or in education or something along those lines. And it's easy to move on to the next issue. And what I feel sometimes is helpful is for people to not let that be forgotten, right? For us to think in our own organizations, do we want to share this on our own, institutions and our own newsletters, circulate this out into the community, rile up attention, right? And as you rile up attention, and then that's when risk management starts to have to get involved, right? We can't not respond to this anymore because now the optics are getting bad. And in that way, right, is how we can get leverage, right? The ways that these more powerful institutions can respond, right, through the power that we do have, which is our voice, right? So I think it's always important to think about that every time that we read something about that's going on, and that we just, we read this and we go, I understand. We all can read these stories again and again, and it's nothing new, perhaps, but think about how we can use that, right? The times that it does get attention for our own benefit.
Okay, so applying a little pressure, but also what Cassandra was saying about leveraging some of the great work that maybe other municipalities are doing and bringing that back to yours and then fostering a dialogue. Okay, Pauline had a second part to their question. What strategies do you recommend for community organizations to effectively push back against systemic barriers while sustaining long-term impact?
For me, it's all about dialogue. As the organization, create that relationship, that discussion to have that. People, when you create this discussion, this respectful area, you can now start opening their ears to what you're talking about, educate and open their ears. So you want to build that relationship before you start to push. It's always, I love where Jemal's coming from, but we need on both sides. We need people pushing from the outside, people pushing from the inside. You need that tension to make things move. And so therefore, I think it's important from a strategy perspective, create the relationship, start bringing some of these frank and hard conversations to the table, but you build on that to have that discussion.
Yep.
Nadine, Jemal, anything from you to build on?
Nothing more from me, no.
Okay, let's see what other questions we have.
There's one there, Nancy, that I wouldn't mind answering. I think someone's asking if we've had pushback on...
That's the one I was going to ask you. From Anastasia?
Yes.
Yes. Have you each had personal experiences of pushback in Canada on equity, diversity, and inclusion? And if so, which sectors?
Yeah, for me, it was in the financial sector, and I won't obviously name the organization. But, we were doing a body of work and having some conversations around EDI. And at a point they said, we're good now. The murder of George Floyd is long over and we're good. And we were so disappointed at that level from, brilliant individuals and leaders. Like, these were people that make and shape laws, and they felt that we were good. So what is it? There's a disconnect. And I don't know the answer. But there's a disconnect between, I think, privilege and individuals who shape policies that we're still not getting it, we're still not getting it, because they looked me in the face and said, we're good. You know, we had this program where we talked about HR, having it embedded in HR, data to track the measurements and the outcome and all of that. And all of a sudden, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it right now with a lot of organizations. They are pushing back. That is the pushback. They feel that it's not necessary. So we've had that, and what we continued to do was just continue to share the information, share the data. And I can tell you that this report will be shared with that organization with a nice little letter, right? And so that while it's disappointing, we can't stop the conversation. We have to keep pushing. And as Cassandra says, having the dialogue, having the conversations, sharing the materials, and so forth.
Sandra, Jemal, did you want to add?
I'm not going to pick an industry because I live this world of every day. I'm knocking on doors, trying to get them to be open to this. And I've been doing this now for 15 years. So I always share the story with my American friends saying, Canada we're nice people. We'll always say, yes, we're doing this. We have social procurement. We have supplier diversity. And we know when we look at the numbers, they don't. So the big thing is to be able to get a champion who will stand up and have that courage to say it's important for us. We saw after the murder of George Floyd, we had a whole bunch jump up and say, it's important to us. Yeah. But it didn't get as deep as we thought, because all of a sudden when it became hard, we saw them sort of back away from this again. So we need to get a couple champions who have that courage to step up and to be able to sort of follow through on this. But I'm big on, that we need the data to be able to say, where are the gaps? What are you doing for the gaps? And to highlight those success stories. Because there tends to be this belief that we don't have big enough businesses, or we don't have those capabilities, or we just can't do it. We need those success stories, because I love Nadine when she said, see it, be it. But that's even more so for the other side. See, they can do it. See, we have these. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, I didn't realize that. So we need to bring those success stories to the table, and we need to challenge them on that. Because when I started in this world of supplier diversity, the banks came on board because the banks know who their client base were. They knew who the client looked like. The telcos, the telecommunication organizations, they know who their client looks like. Some of the other industries who might not be able to see their client directly, they can sort of say, well, we really don't do business there. We have to see them to see the impact, the end of the line as to who they're doing business with. When they recognize their clients are diverse, they then become more, oh, well, maybe we do need that. We need them to see that endpoint, and we need them to see that connection. Once they see that, then we start sharing the success stories that we do have businesses out here who can do just that.
Yeah. Jemal, did you want to add into this at all?
Maybe what I would add, just from my work is in the health sector, which is a bit different, but I think that there's still learnings from here. One thing that we have been challenged by is the fact that there's usually, or when we're trying to collect data, and race-based data specifically, is that there's this thought that people don't want to answer these questions. People, the staff members are already saying patients won't answer it, and then that is just kind of the resistance that many institutions face. From those now that in the past, like 3 years of those that I've been following along with, they've done the trainings, they've explained to staff members, anti-Black racism, the importance of data, and they've gone through it all. And one thing that I'm now seeing is from those places that actually just went through with it as a whole, their non-response rates or declining to response rates are 4%, 5%, maybe highest I think I've heard is 7%. But it wasn't even necessarily the race-based questions that had that response, because they're usually asking other things. All to say that if I were to flip that, to say that on the other end, you're getting 93, 94, 95% completion rates when you're asking these questions. If we just assumed that people didn't want to respond, you would think that no one wants to answer these questions, that all of a sudden our acceptance rates would be like an abysmal 10%. So it's people's perceptions of this data that actually stops the work way more than the data itself, right? Once you start engaging in this work and start pushing forward, then that's when you see changes actually happen. And so that's the pushback that we in the health system are currently just trying to navigate around. And I suppose what I would want to share for others to think though is to hold that in their hearts, right? Is just believe that there's hope at the end of the tunnel, that at least in one space when they went through and collected this data, people with open arms, as long as you explain to them why, it doesn't affect, whatever they're coming here to do in that, context, is their healthcare services, but in other contexts, it could be other things. Make people feel safe. If you help them understand that there's a purpose and a better place that they can get to with this data, people are willing to work with you on that. So that's what I would want to share.
Yeah, and I just had one thing that I wanted to add. I think what the data does, and as I said in my opening, it's a mirror, and I think when people look at that mirror, they're afraid. They don't know what to do. I think that's really what it boils down to. They're thinking, it's so large, it's so big. Where do we go from here? They don't know we can eat the elephant a bit at a time. I think that's what it really boils down to.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. It's from Parker, and they say, thank you. How do you plan for resistance and respond effectively to concerns? So this is more in the planning side, I gather. Does anyone want to take that question?
I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe what I could just quickly say is one study that I did is I followed a bunch of healthcare organizations as they tried to build Black community data governance, and one major part from that implementation guide, it's a report that we released, is actually addressing challenges and perceptions preemptively. So, getting leaders on board, the importance of this work, equity, for some of these institutions was a bit easier in some ways, but it's actually once they started to tell the rest of the institution that they were going to do this work and focus on Black communities that it became, very, very challenging. So I think by telling, those that are getting on board from the onset that we're going to receive a lot of questions, we're going to receive a lot of feedback. I'm asking why we're doing this. Why are we focusing on specifically Black people? Don't we think other communities also, deserve help? There's a range of things. By having almost that FAQ ready for yourselves and knowing as an institution how you want to respond, you're much better able to, as someone said, stay the course. And one thing I always tell people is, there's no good change that ever happened in the world that was met with arms wide open. And so resistance isn't actually a sign of you doing something wrong, in these cases. It actually means that you're changing something that needs to be changed. Otherwise, right, segregated schools, like restaurants, you list all the things, there's always resistance. So use that as a way to gauge we're on the right path, right? And that's what you need to communicate to leaders as well. So I'll leave with that.
Let me piggyback on that because that's where I was going. When you plan for resistance, it's always make sure you gather the data. You have enough data so that you're actually throwing information data at them. Education is key. People, they rebel against what they don't know. They tend to be very fearful of what they don't know. So the data helps. And so the education data comes together. Plus supporters or champions. You're going to get, this is not easy work. You're going to get some pushback. You need champions who are willing to step out and say, this is what it's done for me. This is how we've been able to use it. And when they see others, there tends to be less fear that someone else has been able to do that. And so therefore, those are the key. You have to know what's coming. Do not go in with rose-colored glasses that they're going to like everything I say and they're going to do everything I say. Because your absolute result, change is fearful. And change will require them to do something different. And they might not make the goals I make. And it's like, what are we going to do now? We failed. All that is coming. So you have to plan for that with the education, the data, the supporters. And it's not going to be a steep curve that goes like that. It's going to be a curve that takes its time. But that's but once you have that, one step in front of the other.
So here's my radical thing. Come to the UN when you hear them talking about reparations. Come! And don't tell me crap about resistance. You're privileged, spend the money, increase your budget, get more people in here and get it done. That's it. Your kids go to private school and everybody looks the same? No. You need to be able to tell another story or influence another narrative. Sorry, not sorry, actually.
I love the Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You got one side, the other side, it's going to move them, right? It's going to move them.
Wait,
Can we now do that Kendrick Lamar song, Ain't Like Us? Can we do that now?
what a way to end. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you to our panelists, Jemal, Nadine, Cassandra. Always a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to everyone on the line. Thank you for your questions. If you need anything else from us, you have our contact. But otherwise, we will follow up with the report, and any questions you have, feel free to send them over. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Enjoy.
Great, and thank you as well, Nancy,
Thank you.
for having this dialogue. Thank you, and to the Diversity Institute. Thank you.